an HTML file, a CSS file, and a massive JavaScript file, usually. Now, back in the day, when we clicked on a link, we would go back to the server, ask for a new HTML page, and that server would send it back with CSS and JavaScript. This time around, things are a little bit different. We request the page, and then all the navigation happens within here because we don't need to talk to the server anymore. The JavaScript file, or our React library, allows us to manipulate the DOM so that now our servers can just focus on sending data. Instead of focusing on, hey, what view to render, what HTML page to send, we can just make API requests and get JSON data back, which is really, really nice. And now our server, maybe if we had a mobile app as well, can also be used as the same one because that JSON data can be sent to a mobile phone because we're not going to be sending HTML files back and forth. It also makes changing the DOM or users interacting with your website faster because it doesn't have to go back and forth to communicate. But there's also downsides to it. Now, the idea of server-side rendering and single-page application is something we'll cover later on in the course, such as the fact that now we have a bigger JavaScript file, so it's more data that we have to send from the server to the front end. But what I want to focus on here is routing. Remember, React is just a UI library, so it doesn't provide routing for us. We need to add that functionality. Unlike Angular, for example, that is a framework and comes with routing pre-built, React says, I don't care about routing, you figure it out. Because it's a smaller library, it lets us pick and choose what routing we want to do. Do we want to implement our own, or do we want to use a library? Now, we're going to be using React Router, which I would say is a standard in large React projects. It's the main one that React developers use for routing. And the problem it tries to solve is the fact that we now don't have that default browser navigation provided by the browser, because the browsers are built around this idea of clicking on links and getting a new HTML file. And React says, well, no, everything is going to be in JSX and we'll just change and update the DOM and we'll let that little robot change the page for us. So how do we solve this? Well, this package we're going to use, React Router, lets us do some interesting things. For example, if I click on a page here, like hats, you see that my URL changed from an empty homepage to shops/hats. Initially, when single-page applications started to take off, because single-page applications didn't really have this functionality, you had this back button problem where you couldn't go back because everything, well, there weren't any links. This wouldn't happen and this would just keep staying empty. So when the browser said back, well, it wouldn't work. And this was a common problem because the navigation inside the application URL didn't change. But the problem is now solved because the browser provides something called a history API. And internally, libraries like React Router and other single-page application routing libraries use this API provided by the browser to essentially hijack and mimic URLs. So that, as we'll see over the next couple of videos, with this library, we can have the same functionality that we had with apps back in the day, but with single-page applications, and still have functionality where we can go back and forth and use the URL, even enter a specific URL, and get to that page. Let's find out more in the next video.
Okay, so what is routing? Well, right now, we only have one homepage component that pretty much comprises our entire app. But what if we had multiple page components, like an about page or a shop page or a checkout page, that needed to be rendered depending on what URL the user was at? Well, that is what routing seeks to solve. And the routing library we're going to use is called React Router DOM. Now, there are other routing libraries out there for React, but React Router DOM is the most popular and most supported library for routing when it comes to building our applications in React. it's easy to understand, and it follows our component-driven architecture. So let's actually try it out. So how do we use it? Well, first we have to install React Router DOM. And what I'm going to do is I am going to kill our server, and I'm going to yarn add React Router DOM. Now, there is a chance that our libraries for Babel Jest will conflict again, like it did when we first installed Node Sass. And if it does, I'm going to show you how we can fix that issue. So if we run yarn start, yes, so we see that that's an issue. Okay, that's fine. The reason for this is because there are dependencies between the React scripts that's in our Create React app for Babel Jest that is different from the one that is being required from some other version of a library that we installed, right? But this is okay because it looks like the major versions are not in conflict. It's just this minor. It's the 7 versus the 8. So what we can do with yarn is inside of our package JSON, we can add a resolutions property, and we can tell it that we want Babel Jest to always be 24.7.1, no matter what. So now, if we reinstall all of our dependencies, we'll see that we're forcing Babel Jest to be 24.7.1. And now, we should have no problem starting our application. Awesome. Okay. So, let's actually see how to use React Router DOM. Well, first, we have to go to our index.js, and we have to import in browser router from React Router DOM. And browser router is a component that we're actually going to wrap around our application. And what this component does is it gives our application that's sitting between this component all of the functionality of routing that this library provides. Now, in order for me to show you what React Router does, I'm just going to write a bit of code first because it'll make more sense if you see it. So I'm going to import this component route from React Router DOM. And then I'm just going to make a quick component that renders out a div with an h1 of hats page. And this is just going to represent another page alternative to our homepage right now, called a hats page. So how this route component works is that it's a component that takes a couple arguments. The main ones that I want to focus on are exact, path, and component. Now, component will be the component that we want to render, right? We want the route to render. So for now, let's just use homepage. The path will be a string that's equal to the path itself from the current place in where we're at. So because we're at the very base of our application, right? The URL is gonna, when we put slash, the base URL is just localhost 3000 or like our URL without any additional sub URLs following our URL. So what this means is that when the URL is at the base, right, just slash, then I want to render the home page. So when we're at localhost, I just want to render the home page. Exact is a true or false property. So we either pass true or false. And if you just keep it as this with no equals, then it's equal to true. It means that this path must be exactly slash in order for this component to render, our homepage component to render. If the route, for example, without exact, let's say the URL was localhost 3000 / hats, right? Slash is technically still true. This part of the URL right here is still true. So our homepage will actually still render. So let me show you how that would happen. So let's write another route where our path is hats, and when it's hats, we want to render the hats page. Well, now if we go to our application, if we navigate to hats, we'll see that we have our home page, and then underneath we have our hats page. So without the exact, as long as the path matches, right? As long as it's present, then it will render the home page. But if we make sure that it's exact, then now it won't render the home page unless it's exactly this path of just the slash. Like so. These are pretty much the main things that we need out of our route component. There's a couple others for more nuanced examples that we might explore later in the application, but most of the time it's very easy. You can just go to the React Router DOM quick start documentation and you can see all of the API that you have access to. But this routing is the main one that we're going to utilize. The other component I want to show is the switch component. Now, to use the switch component, we wrap our route components within it. Now, what it does is the moment that a route inside of it finds a match in the path, it does not render anything else but that route. So before, when we went to our hats URL, right, if we remove the exact, if we go to our hats URL, we know that we were matching the slash and the slash hats. But switch will match slash first, and then it will not render anything else after it. So if we look and we go to hats, right, we'll see that we have our home page, but there's no hats page. And the reason for this is because of switch. So the moment switch sees something match the path, right, as long as a route gets rendered, then it just renders that route. It renders nothing else. Now, if we put the exact back, then we will, of course, render our hats page because this home page with the exact path of / never matched at this URL of /hats. And if we go back to our home page, well, we're going to render our home page. So the switch is useful because it gives us more control over our code, right? It allows us to kind of follow a pattern where we know that as long as one route matches, then that's the only thing we're going to render. And that's useful if we don't want to accidentally render multiple components, right? It's just a lot more control that we get from the library. But this switch and this route component, they're the basic components that we're going to use to build out this application. And as we build, of course, we're going to pull in a little bit more and we're going to write some more complex code with React Router DOM. But conceptually, this is what routing is in our project. Okay. Now, before we continue, I think it's really important to cover a couple fundamental concepts in React Router DOM. And to do so, I've built this very quick little application to demonstrate. All it is it has 3 pages. It has a home page, it has a topics page, and it has a topic ID page, right? A topic detail page. So 3 pages. Now, if we were to look at the code for this, we would see that it's just 3 functional components that render divs with the h1 telling us where we're at. And then it's all nested in routes inside of our app component, right? Our home route is the base slash path with the component homepage. Our topics route / topics, and then our topics detail is / topics / topic ID. Now, I know that this : topic ID is kind of new, but we're going to cover that a little later. The first thing that I want us to look at is our homepage. The reason why is because one of the things that React Router DOM does for us is that any component that gets rendered by our route gets passed 3 arguments. The component that gets rendered is going to be the component we pass into our component property on our route. But what do those 3 properties look like? Well, let's log them out and see. Let's navigate to our home page, and let's open up our DevTools. We'll see that the 3 props that we got passed were a history prop, a location, and a match. Now, the one I want to look at first is the match. So there's 4 things we get inside of our match. The first is the URL. The URL is just the URL of our component that it got rendered up to from the route. Now, what do I mean by this? So, if we were to look at our route for homepage, right? We learned that in our last lesson, without this exact keyword, any of our paths that start with a slash and then anything after is also going to render our homepage. Because technically, if we were to navigate to /topics now, we are still matching the / portion of our URL, right? Which means that this route pattern is matching for our homepage. But if we were to look at our match, we actually see that the URL only matches up till the /, not the /topics. So that URL, no matter what we type, even if we were to navigate all the way here, and the URL property on our match will always only display the URL up until where it actually matched. Now, the path property is just the pattern that the route is looking to match. So the path property for our home page would be just the /. The path property for our topics list would just be /topics. And then for topic detail will be /topics /topic ID, which is what we see here. If we were to log this in each of these components, we will see that that is exactly what we'll show. So if we were to navigate to topics, we'll see in our topics that the path is just the /topics, which is the pattern that it's matching in the route. The isExact property is the one that's matching, that is only true if the entire URL matches the pattern. So while it's true for topics, because we're at /topics, it is false for our homepage that despite it being rendered, it's not a perfect match because there's more of the URL than what is being matched by the route. Finally, the params property is an object of URL parameters. Now, what's a URL parameter? This is a URL parameter or a route parameter. When we write this in our path, we're saying that this route is waiting to match anything up to /topics and then / anything in this spot after. It can be a dynamically changing value, right? But that topic ID value, we want to be able to access as a parameter. Now, why is this important? If we were to navigate, so let's make our homepage exact, right? If we were to navigate to /topics /13, we actually now have access to that in our param, but let's log it first. So we'll see that in our match, we now have access to this topic ID 13. This is really useful because let's say in our topics detail, we wanted to show which topic we're looking at. Well, we would be able to access it by going topics.match.params.topicID. And if we wanted to use this ID to fetch a set of data related to this specific topic, right? It's good that in our topic detail page, we have access to that specific ID. So these parameters and doing it with this style allows our topic detail to populate itself if we needed it to from some kind of backend database based off of what specific detail it's at. And our topic detail now is aware of it. And usually we store this based on the URL parameter, right? Like if you look at many web applications, you'll see that if you are looking at one of your friends, for example, on Facebook, it'll say facebook.com/profile/ and then their either email or some unique identifier. So that is why this param pattern is so valuable. Now, the next thing is the history. Now, the history one is quite complicated, but the main thing I want to focus on is the push. So there's two ways to navigate in React Router DOM between our pages. Right now, we've just been dynamically updating the URL and getting to different pages. But in reality, the first one is the use of this link component. And the link component is a special component that React Router DOM gives us that lets us dynamically pass in this property of to, and then the string of where we want this link to take us to. And now if I go to home, I have this, what looks like a modified A link that will take me to this link. The only difference between this and our actual topics is that React, you got to remember, is a single page application, which means that it's not actually redirecting you and rebuilding the entire application every time the URL changes. We're really just hijacking the URL's position to determine with JavaScript what part of the DOM to take off and then what part of the DOM to replace, right? What component do we want to remount or mount? We're not trying to re-render the entire application, which was typically the case before we were building React applications, because React is an SPA, a single page application. So because of this, an A-link would actually force you to redirect and re-render the entire application, whereas using the React Router DOM link, we're just borrowing the URL to tell our application what to re-render. Now, the other way to do this type of navigation is using the history prop. So if instead of a link, we wanted to use a button, and in the on-click of our button, we would pass it a function that gets called whenever it gets clicked. And in this function, we would call the history prop, right? And we would tell it .push and then the string where we want to go. So this is equivalent to using a link, but it gives us more dynamic access, right? We can dynamically, functionally control when we want this to work. So if, for example, we wanted to do this in a component did mount instead, right? We couldn't render a link in our component did mount because it's just a functional call, right? It's a method. We would use history.push. And we'll see that here, right? We have this topics button. We can just click it and go. So that's the main use that we get out of the history prop. The third prop that we have is the location. The location prop actually tells us where we are currently, like what is our application. The main thing I want us to focus on is the path name. Ignore these other properties. Let's just look at the path name. If we were to navigate, let's not make our homepage exact again. If we were to navigate to / like all these random sub-URLs, even though our homepage still matches, our location gives us the full path name of where we are currently. So this is useful because our application, our components, in some way can become aware of what the full URL looks like. Now, why would we use these properties? Well, the history one with the push, we understand. Location, we can see why we might need the path name at some point. But the main usage of match, beyond being inside of a specific topic detail, another useful thing about it is that this allows our components to build out a nested route structure. So what do I mean by nested routes? Well, let's say, for example, our topic detail page renders out a bunch of links, right? Or sorry, our topic list page renders out a bunch of links to a bunch of topic details. Well, we could have the link, and this link will go to a dynamically generated route. Let's say we want to say props.match.url, right? So we want to use the current URL. And then we want to say that we want to go to any topic detail, right? We want to go to, let's say, I want to go to 13, for example. And this one is to topic 13. And let's do this for a couple others, 17, 21. These are all just random. Well, now, it doesn't matter where our topics list is. It will always now be aware and know how to take us to that URL, right? Even if our topics list was at some obscure, long URL that it was not aware of, assuming that this was the case, right? Now we can change it in our route but now our topics list doesn't care. Let me just hide our homepage as well. Now our topics list doesn't care about anything regarding where our URL is from the point of where it matched. All it cares about is that I'm trying to render out or take you to different topics, right, from my path onwards. So this is how we can build out dynamic routing without our topics list being aware of the entire URL, right? And we can now reuse this topic list in multiple places as long as our topic, right, our topic detail, as long as we have the appropriate routes for it. So we can even replicate this with just the blog topics, but we can still use the same component for it. Because now, right, we have this topic list that works, but we also have this topic list that works. And they can take you to different topics. Essentially, we've compartmentalized and able to reuse our topic list and topic detail with dynamic routing. That's why this match property is useful. So we will see this a little bit more. So these are still very abstract concepts, but it's very valuable for us right now to know what they are. So armed with this knowledge, let's keep building our application. We just learned how to navigate throughout our application using the link component and the history property that we get from React Router DOM. Now, how would we actually go about setting up our menu item